And welcome to the Mahtab Aziz Celebrity Lawyer Show. And today we will be having our guest will be Sal Bashir. Good morning, Sal.
Oh, good morning, Tom. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. We had intended to have you live on the show, but unfortunately, because of circumstances beyond our control, we couldn't sort of get you live today. But how are you doing otherwise?
Everything's really well considering the COVID situation, but everyone's coping as much as best they can, and you just got to remain positive. And we've got to try and get through this all together.
Yes, that's right. And I take it, obviously, that your performances obviously have been not as frequent as you'd have liked.
Oh, they've been severely hampered since March and the original lockdown. And I've just been keeping myself busy with doing things around the house and trying to, as I said, just trying to remain positive and doing things, with the family and visiting friends and building garden furniture and repairing the house. Yes. the list goes on.
Right. So, yes, I've seen your handiwork. I think you're a bit of a deft DIY. Some of the stuff you've done is quite good.
Well, I'm not a carpenter or anything like that. I wouldn't go building the houses and extensions for people in the fear that it'll probably fall down. But the odd bit of garden furniture and stuff like that is fine. That's okay.
Sure.
Get away with things like that. But and doing the odd recording in my makeshift home studio and staying in touch with my fans, which is something I very, very much miss. Hello, fans out there. I love you all.
Right. That's great. Thank you. And today, of course, we will be touching upon the issue of how black musical artists actually influenced Elvis. This is a sort of a whole subject area that not often touched upon, but it has a sort of a very sort of varied history. When Elvis first started getting interested in music, I believe the producer was Sam Phillips, and I think it was his idea to try and perhaps get a singer who could probably sing like the black singers at the time, and he felt that would be a successful formula. How correct is that?
It was very correct, actually. You've done your research very, very well. Sam Phillips was a pioneer of rock and roll music, having his Memphis recording studios situated there in Memphis, Tennessee, and of course it produced Sun Records. And when Elvis walked in there to record a song for his mother on what they called a piece of acetate, Marian Kaiska, who was the secretary at the time, recalled Elvis's voice being quite unusual, and Sam Phillips wasn't there at the time, so she recorded some of the stuff that Elvis did and put it to Sam, who made it very, very clear that if you could get a white singer to sound, have the feel, have the soul of a black singer, that would prove to be extremely popular, and he could make £1 million and do very well. Yes. But Sam wasn't just doing it just because of the money. He just knew that was something that was going to appeal to the mainstream American market. And of course, when the opportunity arose to use Elvis, he called in Bill Black and Scotty Moore, who already were at Sun Studios doing the odd session work, and then the rest is history. Elvis was jumping around playing That's Alright Mama, and Sam Phillips was bowled over by the sound and the feel, and he knew he had captured lightning in a bottle, and as I say, the rest is history.
Yes, I mean, I'm looking back. I think Mr. Phillips was probably ahead of his time in one sense, because obviously, now we don't realize how, unfortunately, segregation and a form of apartheid, how that was so prominent in the southern states at that time, and for him to think that this could be a success, I think was a bit, detached from probably popular thought at the time.
It was. One must remember that Sam Phillips was a very charismatic individual in himself, and he had a lot of friends in the radio world around the South, so he knew you could call them some favours, and it was groundbreaking stuff that he was trying to do at the time, and it was very well known that Sam Phillips was recording coloured artists, black people in the studio, and giving them a break, and quite rightly too, because Elvis himself was influenced by many great singers from the black community, and it was never a secret that he owed an awful lot of his own influences and success to black music. And there's just numerous people littered in rock and roll history that were there before Elvis, or at the same time as Elvis, and came after Elvis, who've all tipped their hat to being influenced by the king of rock and roll. People like B.B. King, yeah. James Brown, you had Roy Hamilton, Mahalia Jackson, even across the acting world, even later on, even people like Eddie Murphy absolutely loved Elvis because they were hugely influenced by him. Yeah. And I think Little Richard was one of the most charismatic and legendary rock and roll artists who we sadly lost recently. Yeah. Said Elvis was an integrator. He said before Elvis they wouldn't let black music through, and Elvis opened the door for black music, and that's coming from the great Little Richard.
Oh yes, certainly that was a point I was going to make. In fact, Sam Phillips' efforts, in fact, probably assisted or helped, black music to come to the wider audience. I mean, to put things into perspective, I mean, this was going on in the early 50s, say about 52, 53, but 10 years later, Muhammad Ali, who just won the gold medal at the Olympics, was refused service at a restaurant. So if you could put it into perspective in that way, that when all this was going on, 10 years later, Muhammad Ali was refused service at a white restaurant. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is the thing. There was still a lot of segregation. There was still a lot of them and us going on, and it's hard to imagine that. We're not talking about the 1800s or the 1900s. We're talking about 1963. We're talking about the great Muhammad Ali who's just come set foot back on his home country soil and refused service. It's almost unimaginable now. But Elvis again. He would never have approved of something like that. And he loved Muhammad Ali. Yeah. He met him on a couple of occasions and presented him with a robe. So, you're right. It was a very difficult time, and Sam Phillips was doing something very much ahead of his time, very much.
And I believe that on some occasions when Elvis was actually singing on the radio, they had to actually verify that he was actually not a black person by saying by mentioning the school that he attended, because people, assumed automatically that he was a black singer.
Well, first and foremost, the name Elvis Presley, even back then, was a very, very unusual name. Yeah. So when they heard Elvis, because before anyone saw Elvis, they heard Elvis. So they naturally assumed that the name Elvis Presley belonged to a black person. And of course, when Elvis turned up to do the shows, those early shows, they realized that the man was white. But even then, the radio stations back then still refused to play the record because they thought that Elvis was black. So it was very hard to push through those early Elvis records because of, well, as you just mentioned, there was a huge amount of segregation going on for the black people.
Yes. And at the time, of course, he had banded together with three other chaps to form this sort of like a singing group, and it wasn't successful straight away, I believe. I mean, it was something that people sort of realized a bit later, after they'd been singing for a while, that in fact this was a very, very good, potent combination.
It was. You're speaking of Bill Black and Scotty Moore, and Elvis, and then DJ Fontana joined them a little bit later on. In '56, he was the session. He was the main drummer for the Louisiana Hayride, and yes, they played everywhere. Sometimes on the back of a flatbed truck, and they played the halls, the college halls. So Elvis served his apprenticeship, and he knew his stuff. By the time Elvis came to RCA Victor, this man was he'd been polished. He was very polished before he came to RCA Victor. So they played all those southern towns, and I'm sure some of those places that they played, there was probably a lot of backlash from probably the white audiences having a go at Elvis, that he's probably trying to be, black, which he wasn't. He was just doing what he felt, which is presenting the music that he felt.
Oh yes, and I have read that in fact there was this sort of like dichotomy of appreciation, in the sense that the female fans loved him, but apparently there was the young sort of male at that time, in fact, almost were sort of conspiring to sort of beat him up at certain venues. I mean, what was the reason for this sort of split in sort of favor in how people appreciated his music?
I think Elvis was the first guy that came along that was almost the same age as the music that was appealing to the teenagers. Before that, you had Bill Haley. Well, Bill Haley, although a brilliant artist in himself, was quite a few years older than Elvis and represented a sort of a daddy image to everybody and a granddad image to the teenagers. But Elvis was their own. Elvis was almost the same age, and he appealed to them because he had these astounding looks, this wonderful, talented man. I mean, the pictures of Elvis prove what a gorgeous specimen he was, and the women and the girls and the teenagers loved him. And yes, there was a lot of jealousy from the boyfriends of these girlfriends, but at the same time, a lot of these guys started to copy Elvis, and not just off stage, but on stage, with singers like Fabian and your Bobby Rydells and your Bobby V's and your Cliff Richards. They all wanted to be Elvis. Yeah. So he influenced a lot of people later on, and I think his influence is still felt right up and to today. Yes,
and it's amazing that in fact Elvis actually never received any formal music training, and he couldn't even read music, in fact. So for him to become to get to the stage or the sort of reputation that he has, it's amazing. I mean, it's just like some athletes sort of becoming a sort of top class without having any training, formal training. I mean, it's just amazing how he's done it.
Well, some people are just born to rock, and I think Elvis was born to rock. When you look at history, and musical in particular, we're talking about musical history, Paul McCartney, no formal training whatsoever, could read music, John Lennon, and the music industry is littered with geniuses who've never had a guitar lesson, a cello lesson, can't read music, and yet their accomplishments are absolutely outstanding. Yeah. Elvis could feel the music. It doesn't matter where you come from. Every person has got soul. Yeah. Every person has got soul. And Elvis brought this onto the stage, and it was evident that you were watching, you were listening to something special. There's some vibe, there's some charisma, there's some personality that is glowing in front of the microphone, that's glowing on stage. Yes. And people feed off of that. So when Elvis sang a song, the listener was led to believe that he wrote the music, because Elvis pushed those lyrics so emotionally to the listener that you felt that he must have written this song because he believed in the song. Oh, yes. He didn't just sing the song. Okay, he believed in it. Yes. And that's what the listener and people like myself felt, that he was actually singing to me as an individual.
That's right. And the other aspect that's people look into in terms of how he became successful and what he didn't have that normally people would have is that of course he came from a very sort of poor background. In fact, he used a guitar that was given to him as a present when he was I think about 10. He carried on using that same guitar into some of the sessions that he in fact was playing with adult musicians that played with him.
Well, the session that the guitar was given to Elvis from the Tupelo hardware store in Memphis. He actually wanted a bike, but he was given the guitar. And the guitar, Elvis received some guitar lessons from his uncle, from family members, and he picked up a few chords from the locals. And quite honestly, when you're playing the guitar, main chords that you need to really know in rock and roll, and I've heard Paul McCartney say this is just the three, which is E, A, B, 7, or if you want to expand it a bit, you can go from C to G, you can go to A. So there's only really 3 or 4 chords you need to know. The most sweetest one out of the whole lot, again quoting Paul McCartney, is the B7. And so Elvis picked up those 3 basic chords and he mucked about with them, and he was able to get a sound out the guitar, and it fitted very well into the rock and roll music, because most rock and roll music, basic rock and roll music, is really only 3 or 4 chords anyway. So Elvis did extremely well. Whilst he wasn't in the same category as your Eric Claptons or your Jimmy Pages, Elvis didn't need to be. He just needed to, well, first of all, he looked good with the guitar, and he certainly could play the songs that he played on stage. So, yes, again, he influenced a legion of guitar players later on as well.
Right, and of course, you mentioned his voice. There was something very, very unique in his voice. As you said, although he may not have written, the songs, but the way he sang them is as if they were his own, and if he had sort of, written them himself. And this is an incredible quality that he had. We're coming up to our first break, Sal. So thank you very much.